Thanks for choosing this free Anfield Index podcast. If you'd prefer to listen to this or any of our other shows without adverts, then now's the time to check out Anfield Index Pro. With AI Pro, you can supercharge your entire listening experience. You'll not only get all of our podcasts without the ads, but you'll have them far faster with our Quick Publish feature available exclusively for subscribers. AI Pro also puts you in the heart of our sound studio, with an option to listen to many of our shows live and interact with the podcasters in real time as the shows are recording. Upgrading couldn't be easier. AI Pro is available on all popular podcast platforms, and we have our own apps for Apple and Android. Just head on over to AnfieldIndexPro.com and get started today.
It's accounting season, and you know what that means. Welcome to a very topical Money Talks episode. My name is Tadio Chanakira, aka Tad Predicts, and I'm joined by the franchise, the face of Money Talks, Mr. Mo Chatra. Mo, thank you so much for doing these. I know Money Talks is one of the fan favorites, and it's definitely one of the more informational football podcasts out there. And we're back with another great and timely topic discussion. So welcome and thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thank you, Tad. Really glad to share in some of my limited insight on the Liverpool Football Club accounts, which have just been published in the last few days as we record this. So, yeah, glad to be divulging my thoughts with our listeners.
That is awesome stuff. And, you know, for many people, when those accounts come out, it's more, you know, try and decipher what is going on there and what to really look for. And to borrow a phrase from my dad, finding someone that makes money make sense. And if, you know, there are very few people in especially the football Twitter world that I've seen that actually make it make sense a lot more than making me more confused after listening to them. And you're certainly one of them. And I've always found a good way to kind of at least start these kind of conversations is getting a broader picture, kind of, you know, the headlines. So in saying that, what are the headline takes from this year's accounts? You know, overall, do they present a positive or a negative view of the club's finances?
Okay, so I think that the accounts overall can best be described as encouraging in the grand scheme of things. So the accounts present a picture of Liverpool Football Club having generated turnover, which is all of the income, of £487 million. And the net position, which is either a profit or a loss, ended up at 4.8 million loss before tax, then 9.5 million loss after tax. So one quick aside on that, people might be wondering, well, if the club made a loss, why did it then have to pay more tax, which then made it a bigger loss? And that's because the tax relates to operational affairs, and therefore there's certain things which incur taxation before losses are even factored into the equation. So that is why there is ultimately taxation incurred. Whereas for those people out there who run their own businesses, ordinarily, if their business makes a loss, then they would be paying no tax, or in some cases, people who may be creative in their accounting and declare that their business has made little or no money, or little or no profit, would be paying minimal or no tax. So that aside, I said that it's still encouraging, and the reason I say that, despite the loss, is obviously COVID and the pandemic. It did have a massive impact on the club's finances, and the key area in which the impact was felt was Matchday revenue. So when I mentioned the turnover figure at the start, turnover is broadly comprised of three revenue streams: Matchday, media or broadcasting, and commercial. And Matchday is generally the money that's generated on match days, through gate receipts and sales of food and drink in and around the stadium, and other income streams around the match day itself. That would typically, in a non-COVID year, be in the region of about 85 million. For the 2021 season, stroke financial year, it was all the way down to 3.6 million. But that was an impact of over 80 million pounds from loss of matchday revenue. And had that not been the case, then the turnover for the club overall would have been in the region of about 569 million pounds. So that's the level of impact just from matchday. But there was also somewhat of an impact clearly on commercial revenue. So commercial revenue we'll come on to a bit later on, and also broadcasting revenue, which is the prize money from the Premier League and the Champions League, and also the piddly amounts, relatively speaking, that the club also makes from the other domestic competitions, the FA Cup and the Carabao. That all factors into that, and that amounted to 266 million. But overall, I say it's a good position because not only in light of COVID and the impact it had and still only make a relatively minor loss, but also comparing against other clubs where the losses were in excess of six figures, so in excess of £100 million loss for clubs like Arsenal and Chelsea. And so when you compare our position as a club to other rivals in the Premier League, it's a very good position. The only club from the Big Six to have made profit was Manchester City, but as has been noted by me on many occasions, that their accounts have to be taken with a pinch of salt. The owners do ensure that the sponsorship figures and commercial revenue ultimately in their accounts say whatever they need to say in order to present a reasonable position in the eyes of those that own the club and run and manage the club. So I almost discount what the Manchester City accounts have to say these days. They as the ultimate owners, Abu Dhabi, can make those accounts say pretty much what they want. But for the rest of the Big Six, we compared very favourably.
Very, very interesting. And you obviously mentioned, the Man City accounts aside, I guess then the next big one would be Man United's accounts. And one of the things you've spoken about is Liverpool, closing that gap in the turnover between Man United and Liverpool over the recent years. And turnover is quite an interesting collection of monies coming in, and broadly comprised of media, commercial, and match day, as you've touched on lightly there earlier on. But I've got two questions for you with regards to that. Firstly, why is the income from transfer fees not included? And then secondly, if you'll indulge me, we had the pandemic, we had the football season, so to speak, kind of mixed and mashed in terms of which years they were put into. Did the media income factor in any prize money from the 1920 season, given it finished in the 2021 financial year?
Okay, so I'll answer the second question first, and then the other question after that. So in short, yes. So the 1920 season ended near enough 2 months into the 2021 financial year. So the financial year for this club commences from the 1st of June. And as we know, the Premier League season for 1920 ended towards the end of July, from memory. So yes, it would therefore have meant that some of the income fell into the 2021 financial year, which related to the 1920 Premier League. And the Champions League, again, though it finished as a competition in the 2021 financial year, obviously, as we know, the club exited the competition before the pandemic struck, and so therefore all of its income was earned in the 1920 financial year. So the Champions League, though it as a competition, also like the Premier League, concluded in 2021 for 1920. its income was already incurred and banked for 1920. And that is why the revenue for broadcasting overall was £266 million, whereas for the previous season for 1920, it amounted to just under 202 million, so an increase of 64, and that was driven largely by the fact that income from the previous season had been banked into 2021. Now, going back to the first part of the question, so the reason that accounts do not include incoming fees from buying clubs, purchasing clubs, when it comes to sales of Liverpool players or player registrations, is because it's treated as effectively like a non-cash item in the accounts. So it is something that is separated out within the accounts in terms of the overall position. So turnover only comprises those three cash income streams, and then within the accounts there's a section which is referred to as profit or loss on disposal of players' registrations, and that is where listeners may have heard of the term amortization. That is not a cash entry, that's actually an accounting entry. So just to explain that, if a player has been signed for £30 million and it's a 5-year contract, the amortization is £6 million a year. So in other words, that cost is then effectively spread out over 5 years during the duration of that contract. Now, if that player were to be sold 2 years into the contract for £40 million, at that point, the accounting position on that player is that player is worth 18 million. So you've taken 2 years of 6 million each away from the initial 30 million, leave you with a book value, if you want to call it that, of 18 million. But the 40 million that's come in for selling that player to another club means that it's 22 million in profit. 40 million sale, 18 million book value results in the 22 million. So because it's treated as a non-cash type of movement, that is why it's separated out from the rest of the turnover. However, if you look at accounts for clubs around Europe, they tend to lump in monies from transfers with turnover, whereas in this country that is not the case. Turnover is only the broadcast, commercial and matchday, and so that is why there is separation.
Interesting stuff, Mo. Let's keep the vibe going with the incomings here. Let's turn our attention to commercial income. It's largely flakiness kind of flatlined compared to 1920, looking at the financials here that I have in front of me. So despite the new Nike deal coming into effect and the club striking a new deal for the sleeve sponsorship, what I thought was quite timely and well done, would you say 2021 was therefore a good or a bad year on the commercial front?
A good question. I think that overall it has to be looked at as a good year, but within that there would have been some minor disappointments in my view. So let me just elaborate then. So it is good that the club actually didn't see a decrease in its commercial revenue. Let me explain. So though the club saw commercial revenue flatline, that was not the case for some of the clubs around them. So there were clubs such as Manchester United, for example, who saw their commercial revenue decrease by £47 million, which is absolutely huge. And then you had Arsenal Football Club, their commercial revenue dropped by 6 million, Tottenham Hotspur by 10, Chelsea by 17. The only club to buck the trend, surprise, surprise, was Manchester City. But again, their commercial revenue has to be taken with, never mind a pinch of salt, but several bags full of salt. So let's put them aside. If you compare our commercial revenue to other clubs whose commercial revenue in their accounts is a little bit more credible, we actually perform very well. Now, the reason I said there will be some slight disappointments here or there is because I specifically refer to the night deal. Now, contrary to what the club had reported up until very recently through the media, where they were making it very clear through patch journalists and others that the New Balance deal was worth 45 million a year. And I say they've only up until recently been pushing that narrative is because only in the last week or two they've changed or allowed journalists close to the club to change that slightly to the base being 45 million. So what I've been reporting for quite a while is that in fact the New Balance deal likely for 1920 generated 75-80 million pounds, and that's based on statements that were made in court by Billy Hogan, who is now the CEO of Liverpool Football Club, talking from when he was the commercial director of the club, and he in court did admit that the New Balance deal brought in 64 million pounds for the club in the 18-19 season, and he also admitted at the same time that the New Balance kit in 1920 saw its sales 59% up on 18-19. So if it generated 64 million in 18-19, in 1920, in the final year of that deal, sales were up of the kit 59%. So therefore, to assume income of 75 to 80 million pounds for the last year of the night for the New Balance deal is a fairly reasonable and prudent estimate. Now, based on the fact that the income flatlined, I think it's fair to assume that the new Nike deal generated similar levels of income. So though the sleeve sponsor did change during 2021, it was Western Union. They ended the deal pretty much just as the season was about to start, and a few weeks in, the club very quickly found a replacement in Expedia, and that deal went from 5 million to 9 million a year, which was good work by the club. Nonetheless, income for that revenue stream did flatline, and I think that the club perhaps would have privately hoped that the night deal would have generated a bit more. But as we all know, the club did agree a pretty low, relatively speaking, downside guarantee of 30 million a year. And I think that had they been able to negotiate a slightly better deal on that front, then the night deal in its first year may have touched 100 million at best. But that said, and as the club has noted, many retail stores were closed for the majority of the 2021 financial year. So in terms of physical sales, there was certainly a big impact there, not least of which for the club shop itself at Anfield, which normally generates huge amount of businesses. You and I know, having been on match days, and obviously as many of our listeners are aware, and that shop is normally absolutely thriving and buzzing. It's just got massive humanity flowing through it on a match day, before and after a game, and obviously when there was no fans or barely any fans coming along for the duration of the 2021 season, there would have been a clear impact on that club shop, but also the various club shops that Liverpool has around the world as well. So the impact was there. The impact was through many thousands of Nike stores around the world, who otherwise would have had limited amounts of kit available in the stores. So there was clearly an impact, and the club are certainly hopeful now and expectant indeed that this current financial year stroke season, their business and the revenue from the Nike deal will be comfortably up on last year. So that's encouraging. And the final thing I just wanted to say on commercial is that, I have been critical of the club in terms of the fact that they haven't done it as well as I feel they could have in terms of capitalising on the popularity of Sadio Mane, Mo Salah when it comes to Africa and the Middle East and other kind of Muslim countries. Nonetheless, the club still has, by my understanding, secured some very good non-primary sponsorship deals over the last 12 to 18 months. So I think that when the accounts for this season come out, the commercial position should be up from last year's 218 million. So that is encouraging. And again, we touched upon Manchester United in closing the gap. That commercial gap as of 2021 was down to 14 million. And I think it could well be closed further still in the current season. And if we were to eventually overtake them commercially, that would be a massive achievement, given that only 4 years ago or less, that gap was close to double.
That is very, very interesting. And to me, it almost feels like the pandemic has kind of robbed us of taking that title off of Man United, in my humble opinion. And, the effects of having fans going to match days and filling up the stores and being able to buy merchandise is a huge factor. So let's turn over with a nice bow here. Let's dive in a little bit more into Matchday revenue. It was a relatively paltry amount given barely any fans attended matches last season, as you mentioned. Now that this season looks, quite more normal and normal attendances for, I'm assuming, the rest of the season as well, the 2021-2022 season, what should that mean for the bottom line? And also, how much difference should that increased stadium capacity? What's that going to have on revenue when the Annie Road End expansion? I think that ends next summer, summer next year. What impact would that have as well?
Okay, so as noted earlier, the Matchday revenue was 3.6 million for the club for 2021, and for this season, it looks like they will have been able to have normal levels of attendance for the whole of the season, unless there's some new mutant variant that comes out in the next few weeks, which results in no matches towards the back end of April and May, and massive lockdown restrictions being put in, which is highly unlikely at this stage. But if that weren't to happen, rather, it should be very close to a normal pre-COVID year. And if that's the case, Matchday revenue should be in the region of about 85, possibly up to 90 million, depending on where we get to with the Champions League. So if we manage to get through to the quarterfinals and semi-finals, and also progress well in the FA Cup and have one or two more match days from that competition as well, then it could be touching on about £90 million of revenue. And that's me assuming that the very lucrative hospitality and other packages that they have with companies, for example, that have kind of very expensive deals with the club were not ended, and the club having to renegotiate and sell some of those packages for lesser fees. I don't believe they did. So on that basis, I'm fairly confident that it could be between 85 to 90 million pounds. So straight away, that is an improvement on the 2021 position, just from match day, of 83 up to 86 million pounds. Oh, sorry, 82 up to 86 million pounds. So that's really, really good in terms of the summer plans for the club, and again, perhaps we'll come on to that later on. But also, you talked about the expansion. So yes, the work is well underway now, as we know. to expand the Anfield Road end, and that work is due to complete by around August of next year. So that means that the expanded Anfield Road end should be ready for the start of the 23-24 season. At that point, the capacity will increase by approximately 7,000, taking the overall capacity of Anfield to just over 61,000. If that happens, then, or rather when that happens, then the turnover for match days over a season should be in the region of around 100 to 105 million, which would put it very close on a par with Arsenal, with Manchester United, and only Tottenham Hotspur are likely to be comfortably in excess of that. Their match day revenue will probably be in the region of about 120 million in a typical year. And the reason for that is because of the various non-Tottenham Hotspur related events that they hold in that stadium, which is, I know, quite close to you, but it looks certainly like an absolutely stunning stadium. And obviously, as we know, it hosts the NFL 2 or 3 times a season, and also we'll be hosting, concerts and other very big events. So all of that does go towards Tottenham Hotspur, and I know Liverpool have got permission for events as well. So certainly now that lockdown restrictions have been eased here in the UK, Liverpool will be working hard to try and at the least ensure that they can book in 1 or 2 concerts for the next couple of years each. And again, that will all help towards supporting matchday revenue for Liverpool Football Club.
Yeah, I'm certainly familiar with the Tottenham Stadium. I'm actually going for their game, I think, in 2 weeks' time against West Ham. And certainly when the NFL comes rolling around in October, I'll be back there. So, yeah, it is a beautiful stadium. And I'm sure the expansion of Anfield is definitely going to help us in terms of the turnover side of things. But Mo, everyone's always asking, where does all this money go? I mean, it seems like we're doing relatively well in terms of bringing the money in. If you look at the clubs that we're being compared to and where we were a couple of years ago, it's very promising. But where is the money going? So let's move on to outgoings. Clearly, the biggest cost area would be the wage bill. It decreased, but not a significant amount, which it might have been slightly surprising given the club didn't win any silverware. I mean, I certainly was surprised in terms of how little, if I can say, it decreased, or relative to the contracts and the type of contracts that we give out to players. Is there an explanation for this? And what might be the wage bill looking like if the club wins the Champions League and or the Premier League this season? I won't say that word that has been thrown around. It starts with a Q. That's been thrown around by fans of late. I'm not getting involved in that chat until it's one game away from where I stand from. But yeah, in terms of outgoings, especially wages, what was your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Q word, because as we record this, just before we started this, I was watching the great Andy Tate from Stretford Paddock, who's one of the characters from Manchester United social media, and he was on a rant about his club, and then it was making him further upset when he then came on to, the Scousers might win the quadruple, and he was getting extremely agitated over the possibility that could happen. But that was very, very amusing. But nonetheless, going back to the question, so our wage bill in the 1920 season or financial year was £326 million, and as we know, the season didn't end at the end of 1920; it actually ended a couple of months into 2021, and that is part of the reason why wage bill hadn't reduced by the extent that it ordinarily would have. So the wage bill for 2021 was 314 million, so the decrease was just over, in fact, 11 million pounds. And had the prize money bonuses relate to winning the Premier League not partly coming to 2021, that wage bill almost certainly would have been less than 300 million. So just as a kind of example to illustrate that, Manchester United, their wage bill going back to 1819 was 332 million pounds, but in 1920, which was a season when they had no Premier League football, they only competed in the Europa League, their wage bill reduced to 284 million. So it reduced by nearly 50 million pounds. And this is a club that has contracts that are less incentivized than Liverpool Football Club. So there's less of a onus, an emphasis on bonuses for Manchester United contracts compared to Liverpool's. And yet, for missing the Champions League altogether and not winning any trophies that season had an impact of nearly 50 million pounds. So I don't think it would have been quite as big for Liverpool, because obviously Liverpool did compete in the Champions League in 2021 as it had in 1920. But nonetheless, 1920 would have been significant bonuses amassed from winning many games. Obviously, the club went on an incredible streak up until that Watford game when we lost just before the pandemic hit. And with all the goals, the wins, the clean sheets, the bonuses that would have been paid out for that would have been very significant. But nonetheless, 314 million still compares favourably to other clubs around us. So Manchester City's wage bill did exceed 350 million officially. I say officially because it's been alleged that some of their players, or maybe people close to their players, receive other payments to remunerate the successes achieved by players. But even Manchester City aside, the wage bill for Chelsea was 350 million plus because of bonuses paid out relating to the winning of the Champions League. For that club, the wage bill for Manchester United was back over 300 million at 322, and the wage bills for Tottenham Hotspur increased to over 200 million for the first time, and even at Arsenal it was about 244 million. So that had even seen some growth as well. So Liverpool was one of the few clubs that saw its wage bill decrease. But I think that, going back to your question, if the club is to win either the Champions League or Premier League, or even both, we could be looking at very sizable bonuses having to be paid out. So the overall wage bill could be in the region of about 360 million if one or both of those competitions are won. Don't forget that at the start of this season, the club did renew quite a number of contracts. So whereas in 2021, only one contract was renewed or extended, which was for Nico Williams. In 21-22, at the start of this year, we saw contract extensions for a number of players, and the most talked about of which, obviously, as you know, is that of Jordan Henderson, whose contract was only actually extended by a year. He had 2 years to go. The contract was extended by an additional year, but with an option for a further year on top. So that caused a lot of controversy when that happened. But then there were, obviously, as we know, a number of other contracts that were renewed, such as Virgil, Van Dijk, Alisson, etc. There are clearly some contracts that we hope and or expect to be renegotiated and extended, but that may be no movement between now and the end of the season. But 360 million is my estimate for where the wage bill can end up if we are winning further silverware before the season is done.
Nicely done. Look, I won't comment on contracts that may or may not be signed, but I do like the comparisons that you give with other Big Six rivals. It gives a nice picture of where the club is situated with regards to wage bills. But what about other non-pay expenditures for the club? Was that in line with what you expected? And if we continue that theme, how does it compare to some of the other Big Six rivals?
Okay, so that is normally the biggest cost area. Now, if you go into accounts under expenditure, you'll then find a lot of non-cash movements, so things like depreciation, amortization, and these are transactions that are not involving cash movements. So what I then look for is things that involve money outflow, and that is where I've done a bit of a comparison against the other clubs and found that Liverpool's, if you want to call it other operating expenses, amounted to £93 million. Now, to compare that to other clubs, then Manchester City's was at just a tad under £100 million, if you pardon the pun. But then other clubs saw their figures a lot lower. So Manchester United's other operating expenses were £76 million, Chelsea at 72, Arsenal at 48, Tottenham Hotspur at 60. So those four other clubs, their other operating expenses were a lot lower. Now, what do I mean by other operating expenses? So this is to do with other costs involved with the running and operations of the club. So, for example, stadium costs. So, stadiums cost money to secure, to heat, to light. They've got bills to pay. On top of that, Liverpool has several offices. So it has one in Liverpool City Centre in the Liver building, as I understand it, and there's also an office in London. They may have one or two other offices around the world as well. They incur normally quite sizable fees to do with intermediaries or agents, as they're more commonly known. They also are lumped under other operating expenses. There's the cost of producing club merchandise, which isn't through the normal kit suppliers. So if you go into the club shop, or if you go online, you'll find that the club sells non-branded merchandise and not from Nike. So obviously there are costs incurred with that. They will also have costs to do with buying lots and lots of food and drink. They've got to keep their staff fed and watered. And also on the match day, obviously, they have 50-odd thousand fans turning up, and they have to be looked after as well. So there's costs associated with all of that. So when you factor all of these different costs in, Liverpool's figures were 93 million. And, that is on the high side. It's the highest. If you put Manchester City aside, that is the highest of the other four by some distance. And, that is something that the club is clearly comfortable with, because it typically is the case that their other operating expenses are pretty high compared to some of these other clubs around them. But it's something that I have very limited information on, because Liverpool's accounts don't go into the same level of detail as other accounts, most notably Manchester United. So if you go into Manchester United's full accounts, because they are publicly listed on the New York Stock Exchange, the level of disclosure that they are required to share is comfortably in excess of what Liverpool Football Club are required to divulge through Companies House. And in fact, for those that are really, really interested in, accounts of the football club, the 176-page accounts of Manchester United are some good bedtime reading. And I mean, on a serious note, though, it does give somewhat of a clue, a better idea about the money coming in and money going out from a football club if you look at the accounts of Manchester United, and it gives some clues as to how Liverpool's finances operate as well. But yeah, in terms of the question that was asked, other operating expenses are relatively high, but it is still something that clubs clearly sees as manageable.
That's very good to hear, and definitely one to keep an eye on, and maybe a podcast in the future will be that agents fees that you mentioned. There are new regulations that have been drafted, and they're going to be proposed to stakeholders by FIFA, where they're going to be capping agents' wages, and that's not for this podcast, but just a tidbit for people to look at. Sorry.
I do shed a tear for them.
Yeah, it's not going to be, especially new agents that are looking to enter, possibly getting 1% after tax is not a way to make a living in that industry. But Mo, in the 1920 accounts, we saw that the club borrowed nearly 200 million to help deal with the impact of the pandemic. What was the club's position in respect of borrowing and debt by the end of 2021?
Yes, overall, it was relatively healthy position in that the club of that loan that was brought in the 1920 season. So the club had what's known as a revolving credit facility. So it's basically the ability to call on a loan at any point for any purpose related to the affairs of the club. And clearly when the pandemic came along and the season came to a standstill for the best part of 3+ months, as I understand it, the prize money from the likes of the Premier League and Champions League was deferred. And at that point, the club had no idea how long they might have to wait until that money would come in. So the club is not one that operates in the way that a Manchester City or even a Chelsea up until recently have done. And clearly the owners were not about to part with their own wealth in order to prop up the club. So they called upon the loan, and that was all pretty much brought in full towards the back end of the 1920 season. Now, in 2021, the club did repay back 70 million of that loan. So I think part of it was that the club realised, okay, well, we brought all of this loan in, but we haven't had the need to use all of it. So it's not necessarily a case of the club using 70 million pounds from other revenue streams in order to repay the loan. It was more a case of, well, they've taken all of this loan out, but they've realised they didn't need all of it, so they've paid that 70 million back. And I think that they'll be in a position of reducing that loan further still during this year without it having an adverse impact on available funds, I think. And its overall debt position is a pretty good one. It's, for example, in a position whereby its liabilities beyond a year amount to 220 million, but that is largely comprised of this loan that's taken out, and also the stadium debt for the main stand expansion. So even though that happened close to 5 years ago now, was it? No, in fact, just over 5 years ago. It was ready for the start of the 16-17 season. There's still 71 million pounds owing from the borrowing from that. So for those listeners, regular listeners, that will remember me discussing this subject in the past, what happened was FSG took out a low interest loan of 110 million pounds at the start of that project, which commenced in 2014, and then loaned that money interest free to the club. So they took a low interest loan out and then loaned that money to the club. And so 71 million pounds is still owing from that. I think had COVID not come along, that amount that was owing probably would have been down to about 30 or 40 million. The club certainly had intended to repay that loan back over 5 or 6 years. But obviously, COVID came along, pandemic struck, and scuppered everything. So the club again will be looking to reduce that loan. In the 2021 season, that loan was not reduced at all. So that made clear in the accounts it was 71 million at the start of 2021. It was 71 million billowing at the end of 2021. So I don't think they're going to look to reduce it by necessarily 20 million. It might be 10 to 15, and look to repay it over a longer period of time. But compared to again some of the other clubs around, such as Manchester United, whose debt is now touching £500 million, and then you've got Tottenham Hotspurs, whose debt is, I think 850 million, and that obviously is relating largely to the stadium. Compared to again rivals, its debt position as a club is a pretty healthy, manageable stroke serviceable one. So nothing that should cause any concern either for the owners or even for fans that take an interest in the sort of thing.
That is fascinating stuff. Mo, let's go to maybe the fun part that fans are really interested in. But before we get to that side of things, were there any other items in the accounts that caught your attention and that you'd like to share with the listeners? I want to give you that opportunity before we jump into transfers and how much money Liverpool possibly might have for this coming window.
Yeah, sure. As I noted earlier, these accounts are pretty basic, so they don't go into anywhere near the level of detail that Manchester United's accounts do, where there's a really, really fascinating level of detail in their accounts. But a couple of things that I did note was that the club's workforce increased by nearly 10% during 2021. It's really interesting, given that obviously we had the pandemic well underway, and yet despite that, the number of staff that the club has increased, as I say, by nearly 10%, most notably in administrative and commercial. So they've really been making big expansions in those areas, and by that it also includes things like IT, HR, all the kind of normal things you get in a company. And their employee count was almost the same as Manchester United. So again, making those comparisons with our biggest rival, even on the employees front, we are on the verge of having more employees than Manchester United, which again is quite interesting. The other thing I noted was that the highest paid director, the accounts always declare that, and in 1920, the pay for the highest paid director, who would have been Peter Moores, who was the previous CEO, his pay was 1.3 million. In 2021, the highest paid director was 1.664 million, which was a 27% increase year on year. And that individual in 2021 was Billy Hogan, who became the new CEO of the club and moved away from his role in commercial. He was replaced by Matt Scammell. However, Matt left to get involved in something I think was NASCAR related from memory, or golf, some other sport anyway. And so I think the club hasn't as yet, as far as I'm aware, appointed to that commercial role. But I'd be quite keen to see them bring somebody in that has the uncanny ability to strike deals in the way that Manchester City do. Whoever they've got in their commercial department is a miracle worker, because they spin out new commercial deals by the week. So if Liverpool can find somebody like that, that'd be great. Albeit, rumour has it that Manchester City, on the commercial front, do lowball in order to get as many sponsors in as possible, so that when they present their commercial revenue, they're saying, oh, look, we've got 60 sponsors, even though we're giving cut price deals to Nissan and Tinder and all these other non-Abu Dhabi related companies, allegedly.
Always have to throw that word in there. Right. So let's let's get on to this transfer kitty, so to speak. So one of the things many fans look for when news breaks out about their club's accounts is any clues, hints about how much money or how little money they might be to spend on transfers in the summer. From your analysis, are you able to shed any light on that? I know you mentioned, for example, Liverpool's accounts might not be as detailed as United's one, but obviously with them being a publicly traded company, there are a lot more obligations on them. But what hints are we seeing from the accounts that Liverpool do provide?
Okay, so what I've done is looked at what the accounts are divulging to try and look into the future to estimate. Well, firstly, how much money are we likely to generate this season? But then secondly, what kind of costs may we incur, which will obviously have an impact on the funds that might be available. So firstly, I look at how much we're likely to generate in terms of revenue. So as we touched on right at the start, the amount of revenue that was generated this season was 487. Sorry, in 2021 was 487 million pounds. Though the broadcast revenue was slightly skewed by the fact that it incorporated prize money from previous season. So for this season, then, on the assumption that we only make it to the next round of the Champions League and exit the competition at that stage, and obviously we all hope that that isn't the case, but that we all are pining for getting to the final and winning the competition for the seventh time, clearly. But if we prudently estimate we only get through to the next round and then that'll be it, then the generation of income from that will be in the region of about £80 million. Then on top of that, Premier League prize money looks very certain now that we'll be in the top two places. We should be generating in the region of about £170 million from the Premier League competition. So the two competitions all told, we should be looking at in the region of about £250 million, which would be fantastic. Now, on top of that, commercial, as I touched upon earlier on, for 2021 was 218 million. I think we're looking at probably 225 to 230, based on some of what has been fed back to me. So then we look at match days. So as I touched upon earlier, we were looking at in the region of 85 to 90 million pounds for this season, depending on how we get on in the remainder of the season when it comes to cup competitions, and potentially getting in one or two more games at Anfield over and above those that we already know will take place in terms of remaining home fixtures for the Premier League. So when you add all of those figures up, we are looking at in a region of about 550 million pounds, give or take 10 million, 20 million this way or that way, depending on if we get all the way through to the final of the Champions League. So what that means is we'll be generating record turnover in 2021-22 season. And on top of that, I then had a look at cash flow. So the cash flow statement strips away non-cash movements. So I've talked about things like depreciation, amortization. And what I looked at in the cash flow statement is how much we as a club actually paid towards transfer fee installments to clubs that had sold players to us. And what we did, and there's a line in the accounts called acquisition of player registrations. Now that for 2021 was 90 million pounds, 90.2 million pounds. Now only go back 2 or 3 years, that figure was 173 million. So we paid out from all the money we generated 173 million only about a couple of years ago, and yet by 2021 that was down to 90 million. And clearly that is because since 2018, relatively speaking, we haven't spent huge amounts as a club. We saw very little business done in 2019 in the summer after we won the Champions League. In summer 2020, we clearly brought in 3 notable signings in Tsimikas, Thiago and Chatra. And what we did was make lower initial payments, given that COVID had just set in and the pandemic had kind of become a thing only a matter of 3 months or so, 3-4 months before we look to put these deals together for these players. And then in summer 21, obviously the key incoming was Ibrahima Konate. So in terms of 2021, the 90 million would have related to the final payments for transfers from the summer 2018 window. Summer 19 was probably all settled by then, with the exception of Harvey Elliott. And then that 90 million also reflects payments towards Wolves for Jota and to Bayern Munich for Thiago. So when we look at all of that, then we know that the 2018 business is done. So all of the fees owing to deals for the likes of Alisson and others, they're all settled now. And so we only really have the costs relating to those deals that have gone from summer 2020, the Konate deal from 21, and now obviously the deal for Diaz. So the point being that acquisition of player registrations, is otherwise going to be relatively lower amount compared to the high of 173 million from only a couple of years ago. So if you compare those things, then record turnover, outgoing towards acquisition of player registrations, then it means that the funds that should be available should be pretty significant. However, we also know that the club is still intent on reducing its loans and debts, so there'll be money going out towards that. We also know that the Anfield Road End expansion has commenced, so there'll be some costs incurred from that. And as we touched on a few minutes ago, there's a slew of new contracts that were signed in terms of extensions at the start of this season, which in some cases are seeing very significant increases in pay for a number of players. Trent Alexander-Arnold being one example, Jordan Henderson, Alisson, a few others. So when we factor all of that in, what it means is that the club will have more funds available to spend in the summer than it has probably since any time since 2018. 2018, we spent, what was it, in the region of about 200 million, something like that. So it doesn't mean to say that we'll go out and spend 200 million this summer, by the way. What it does mean is that we will certainly have a stronger position to spend this summer. And if you look at the strength of the squad anyway, there's clearly not the need to carry out a massive rebuild of the squad, even though we have a number of players that are hitting 30 now. We're in a position in the way that we're working to perhaps move out a couple of players who are slightly older in age, replace them with a couple more quality additions, and it should bring a requirement on the club to spend, enormous amounts of money, to the tune of 150, 200 million pounds. The club, in all likelihood, I think, will probably look to bring in one notable signing who will be higher value, coupled with one lesser value one, unless, the elephant in the room is the contract extension with Mo is not agreed, in which case, with a year left on his contract, a big decision is left to be made, which is, do we cash in and still generate 80, 90, 100 million pounds for him now, or let him go for free a year later? If the club decides to cash in, almost without question, they will look to replace. And if that's the case, then clearly there'll be another big incoming, maybe not to the same value as him as a player. So clearly the club prefers to buy players at a certain value in a certain bracket. But nonetheless, that's one to keep an eye on. But just in a very long-winded way to answer the question, there will be sufficient funds available to do business, and that's certainly encouraging where Reds should be concerned.
So you heard it here first, guys. There will be money. Whether or not they spend it, don't blame Mo. That's not Mo's decision to make. But certainly in terms of a financial perspective, an accounting perspective, there is room to move there for Liverpool Football Club. Mo, this has been absolutely fascinating, and it's definitely one of those podcasts where I listen to it at least 2 or 3 times to get all the nuggets that you've kind of brought to us here. But that's going to do it for another Money Talks. Mo, do you have anything else you want to plug, put over, or promote before we wrap up?
I'm actually pretty clear in terms of podcasting. I'm one of the resident part-timers, so I'll probably be putting in an appearance in the coming weeks on either Raw or the Nina Casa show. But in terms of Money Talks, I'll likely be back again during the international break to cover some interesting subject or other, which is yet to be determined. But that's going to be my next appearance here on Anfield Index.
Awesome stuff. Guys, from my end, go and check out some of the awesome podcasts that are on Anfield Index. There's AI podcasts with Guy, who stepped in for Carl. He was discussing Inter's UCL game with Dave Hendrick. We've also got the Daily Red podcast that comes out Monday to Friday, usually about lunchtime. If you want to catch up on all the news that is involved with Liverpool, go check that out. From a personal side of things, go to EPL Index, the sister site of Anfield Index, and you can catch Tad Predictable, where I host a Premier League predictions show. We go weekly on there, and I'll also be on EPL Index Roundtable next week, Sunday, just discussing all the news and happenings around the Premier League. But that's going to do it for us. Huge thank you to Mo. Huge thank you to everyone that listened. Huge thank you to producer Guy Drinkle in our ear. And until next time, goodbye.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this Anfield Index show. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel so future podcasts find their way to your device automatically. There's nothing quite like fan engagement, and we'd love to know what you think of anything discussed on this show. The best way to get in touch is over on our free Discord community, where both podcasters and listeners debate the hottest LFC topics 24/7. Sign up free now at AnfieldIndex.com/Discord. You won't regret it. You can also follow us on Twitter at Anfield Index and find us on Facebook by searching for Anfield Index. Oh, and before you go, we'd love it if you could leave us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. It only takes a couple of seconds, and it means the world to the people who create these free shows.